In today's conversation, we talk about one, what is the current state of mobile performance marketing? Two, what are the channels and tactics to achieve success? And three, how should a game studio build a mobile marketing team in today's market? In this conversation, I speak with Warren Woodward, who is the co-founder and chief growth officer at Upptic, one of the industry's most respected mobile growth agencies. He's also one of my favorite people to talk to about ground level truth without BS and without avoiding difficult topics. So for anyone interested in mobile growth or with plans to engage in performance marketing, definitely want to check out this conversation. Stay tuned. We're coming at you right now. So Warren, thanks for joining. I think that of all the people that I talk to when it comes to user acquisition, I think you in particular are great to speak to. And the reason why I like speaking to you is that you provide some specific insights, whether it's like incentives or some of the problems that we're seeing in the industry that other people just don't talk about. I don't know if they're too scared to talk about it or if they don't realize, but some of those nuances I think are very critical and important to understand, especially if you want to have success in mobile gaming. And certainly growth in user acquisition is a core pillar of success in today's market. So jumping right in and just to like get rolling on this, it'd be great to kind of get your assessment about where are we today. And there's different things that I'm hearing when it comes when I speak to different UA marketers as well as the game executives. But from your perspective, performance marketing for mobile gaming studios, what's working, what's not working, what's your current take?
Yeah, Joseph, great to be back with you. Always some of my favorite conversations when me and you can get together either on our pod, your content, or anywhere in between. And maybe kind of one macro thing to your comments earlier before getting into this question about why myself and the team at Upptic like to talk about this stuff. Like, there's a kind of a weird structural problem with sharing user acquisition knowledge the way that the industry is constructed, because most user acquisition teams that are any good are internal at a publisher or a developer. So they're really highly incentivized to not openly broadcast out
Yeah.
when they find something that works. Our strategy here at Upptic is a little bit different. Like, ultimately, for a little behind the scenes, like what we're really trying to build is like a software and tooling business of UA tools. And we kind of treat our kind of agency branch as our laboratory. So like our philosophy is like, be in the trenches, be figuring out user acquisition and growth problems, productize them, and then make them into toolings that small and large teams can use. And this is also why we try to be very open about sharing the tactics that we're kind of uncovering when we break things open. Like we are really trying to like put those in a box and then open them up to larger a larger community of teams to use. So that's just a little bit about like kind of our philosophy of the relationship between our software and agency side, and why we really like to share this information. So your question is very big and broad. Where are we today? What's the state of performance marketing for mobile game studios? There's sort of, we were chatting a little bit before the recording. There's sort of like the narrative versus reality. And I think it's important to maybe identify both. The narrative is super bearish right now still. And we see this kind of at every scale. I'm curious if you're kind of seeing the same trends in your circles, Joseph, but it's like there's continue to be like layoffs, downsizing of user acquisition teams, decreasing marketing budgets. I've seen more and more teams just
More
stating
coming.
like,
More pain coming.
no, just literally, today before the podcast, I learned if another thing. Yeah, I won't say yet because I don't think it's announced, but I'm seeing more and more teams state it as fact of like user acquisition no longer works. Fact, like statement, and just moving to other tactics of like, we're going to, work just with content creators and influencers. We're going to just hope the game succeeds off organic. And that's pretty different from the actual reality. And we've talked about this a lot at length in kind of different venues, just to put a bow on it. The rules just continue to change, and it's just more complicated now. Some things are actually much simpler and more dumbed down. Like, I think we're going to get into like rewarded video networks. Those are really dumbed down from what they used to be as far as like how much of an expert you need to be. But some things are much more complex. Like the largest channels on iOS, Meta, TikTok, Google, these are like non-starters if you don't have like a data science function of some kind to work around the privacy limitations. and we'll probably eventually see something that rhymes with this on Android. That's had a cascading impact of cutting out the big channels on half of the ecosystem. That pushes more competition to the other channels, increasing CPMs, increasing competition in those. And then I also see sort of like a vicious cycle of like, as margins get leaner, teams trying to trim resources, putting fewer data resources with their growth teams, cutting creative down to the bone. Like, how can we get creative as cheap as possible? And that also having like a vicious cycle of deprecating results. So yeah, that's all to say.
Yeah.
In reality, like, when we just look at like apples to apples of our longer term games where we've just been like kind of navigating through the trenches, like performance is not worse overall. We've just had to really change our results with the times. And we have a little different vantage point because growth is our business. Games are not our business. And so we have every incentive in the world when the rules change to like throw our engineers at it, throw our cross-disciplinary teams at it and solve these things. And I think a lot of growth orgs they just don't have those resources in-house. So that's all to say, sorry, I'm kind of going on a rant here. Most growth orgs and game developers only have marketers to solve these problems. And a lot of the problems these days cannot be solved by marketers alone. And that's kind of the theme that I see in kind of the disparity between like the narrative of a lot of game publishers and developers of like why UA doesn't work anymore, and the reality of like what we see if like the problems are getting more complicated to solve, but you can solve them and you can have returns just at the rate or in some cases greater than there were, particularly in iOS than past years.
Right.
So, long preamble. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like part of the problem is there's so much situational, specificity with respect to how do you win in the current marketplace. And there's so many like conflicting, to your point, like narratives and stories about what's working, what's not working. I think the general thing that I've heard is for many game studios, they have seen like, it seems like for some of what I've been hearing is for some of the top games, like UA has not material changed very much, at least for some of the folks who I talk to on their top games. But then they also say, but for the other games, the performance has been declining and the ability to do UA against some of their other, longer tail games has been more difficult. But I think that you could probably provide a little bit more nuance around why that may be happening and things like that. But I guess what you're saying is that overall, you think that performance is actually about the same. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say high level macro. So you touched on something important, which is like there's been essentially parity, or I would say actually increase at like the top of the food chain.
Yeah.
And more pain in the mid to lower tier of the food chain. What is the main differentiator between these? It's resourcing. So there's a bit of an arms race, right?
And here's the other thing that's odd is like, I'm now starting to see huge, like, I don't know about UA team, but UA creatives team for some of these top games of 100 to 200 people, right? And so like we've talked before about how UA teams were getting cut in half during like a few years back. And now we're starting to see certain teams where they're kind of going all in on UA creatives growth with these mega teams. And so, kind of understanding that and understanding also that there are some nonlinear and scale effects from the amount that you spend and things like that. So it's just a huge and complex market. And I think it'd be great to get your thoughts on exactly what's happening in the market today. But in terms of some of the things that I've been hearing, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I see that. I'm trying to be mindful of like, NDAs and respects of like agreements we have with our clients and teams that we talk to. But if you just look at sort of like where some of the big funding has been in gaming over the past couple of years, when we talk to those teams, it is much more common, to your point, that when we're planning a launch with them, they'll kind of come in with the idea of like, all right, we want to plan a launch with, maybe 100 creative to start. It's very different from like years past where it's sort of like, what's the bare minimum amount of creative we can make to like be viable? Big picture, like, our team always talks in the framework of like what we call like the 3 pillars of growth. Nothing original here, but just kind of how we break it down. Those 3 pieces are like the creative side, the actual marketing operations side of pulling the levers, the campaigns, and then the data and modeling sides are just, creative data operations, right? The big macro change, if I want to really simplify this, is the importance of pulling the levers has never been less.
Okay.
And the differentiator that you can get from like expert lever puller versus like a mid-level lever puller is like incremental at best. This used to be like a 10x, 20x factor, back when, I don't know. What year did you start in the industry, Joseph,
Like
as far as in mobile?
2010, 2011.
Okay, so you actually started a couple years earlier than me. I started around 2013, 2014. But back in those days, when I was kind of grinding my way up, there was a ton of edge to be gained by being really good at pulling the levers
Mm-hmm.
within Facebook or within Iron Source, whatever channel you wanted.
Right.
That part is, in the age of advanced algorithms and going into AI, more of that is just in the hands of the algorithm now.
Right.
And to your point of like why the big team's resourcing more for creative, those other two pillars of creative and data modeling, the importance of those is vastly escalating. Let me put that another way. Anyone doing UA has access to like a top tier media buyer now because of the power of the algorithms, right?
Mm-hmm.
So your differentiator from your competition is going to no longer be, oh, I have a really senior UA guy. Doesn't really matter that much, it might matter much as far as like their ability to like work cross-disciplinary, to understand the games, to understand what types of creatives are working, but it's not going to be like this dude can, optimize his Facebook campaigns 20 times better
Right.
than this person over here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I mean, it did seem like when Facebook was really, developing all their AI models with VO, AEO, that was starting to be the trend. And I think that now we're seeing that, to a much higher degree than I've ever seen before in terms of some of these huge teams focusing on creative. And so maybe like one thing that has been a little bit confusing and that's been discussed a lot was the impact of IDFA deprecation. And I think I was wrong before because I felt like Forex and social casino would be strongly impacted negatively because of the inability to target whales. Now, we still have fingerprinting and things of that nature. So I think that's what has been keeping those games going. But can you comment on, what, just for people in the audience to understand what has been, in your opinion, the impact of IDFA deprecation? And do you have a perspective in terms of fingerprinting and what will happen with fingerprinting? And if it goes away, what would happen?
Yeah, a very meaty question. So let's break that down in a few parts. So the actual impact of IDFA deprecation, the direct impact was to the self-attributing networks
Mm-hmm.
on iOS, which was Google, Meta, and TikTok to some degree. TikTok has sort of like they're doing types of fingerprinting now, depending on your MMP and implementation. It's kind of in a gray area right now. That's the direct impact. Those channels are so large that it then has a trickle down impact to all of the other channels, because when you have a target of continuing to grow your business or your user base and you lose, let's call it like 25 to 30% of your addressable market by losing those two channels, very roughly, that's going to it doesn't mean your business goals are any less. So all of that trickles into the other channels. So that's the indirect impact of it as well. The second question, is there still fingerprinting? Yeah, absolutely. It's called probabilistic modeling by the MMP, so they don't get in trouble from Apple. But we still see this definitely on all the rewarded video channels, and meaning like Iron Source, Applovin, Unity as probably the big ones right now. Bungle to a lesser degree. Basically, everyone except for those self-attributing networks I named earlier, they're all still doing fingerprinting. Will it go away? Also, probably yes. I think it's only a matter of time. And a lot of people that write in the space, Sufert and other people that write in the space, I think agree with this. It's just we're sort of seeing like incremental enforcement over time. I think it's not Apple's top issue right now, but it does seem like inevitably marketers will have to make playbooks that don't rely on what Apple has clearly said, like it's not in the spirit of their policies.
So what would happen then if fingerprinting goes away? Then does my original prediction that has not come true yet of social casino and Forex declining significantly. Do you think that happens?
So it's all kind of about we all are playing the game of user acquisition and growth based on, we all have to go into battle with the same rule set, right?
Yeah.
So as long as you have the same limitations or opportunities as your competition, I don't think that anyone is truly forced out. But to your point, I do think that some sectors are going to be more impacted than others. And I think your intuition is correct here, whether or not it's panned out. And I'll kind of explain why. This is kind of connected to like your question of like what happens when it goes away. So we already know because we have this in certain sectors, right? So the way we approached the channels that don't have fingerprinting is we built like a living data model for our analytics and platform, which essentially it's doing like live surveying of user groups. So we'll always have the install from the scan install. What we lose is the post install data.
Yep.
So what our data model is using is it's very simple. If you opt in and agree to, if you consent, great. We're essentially doing a dynamic survey and using the results of the consent users to apply assumptions of the rest of the cohort. That's the philosophy at a large scale. And for us, it's just very clear because we're already doing that. And a percentage of the UA channels, we would just apply the same methodology to all channels as they become impacted and Android becomes impacted.
Right. And what has been your experience with that? So if you're sampling data and using that to, kind of estimate, like if you don't have, I mean, I think at scale, sampling should, law of large numbers. I mean, I think it should work well, but you don't have the level of data precision or measurement that you would if, with fingerprinting or with identifiers. And so is there a risk there, or how would you characterize how well that this current methodology that you're using works? Because to your point, using your sampling methodology, even without fingerprinting, you can at least forecast or estimate what reasonable, performance is of various user acquisition campaigns.
Yeah, correct. So absolutely. And this is why, going back to those three pillars of growth of, the operations, creative, and data, this is why data is getting so much more important. Like if your team doesn't either have access to a data scientist or some tooling like what we build, there's probably other people working on this problem as well that will basically automatically solve for issues like this. You are a huge step behind your competition.
Yeah.
So it's not perfect data anymore. But the good news is like it's the same rules for everybody. So we actually see, with the caveats that like we're modeling off of a subpopulation, but in aggregate and validated for like apps that we have at really large scale, we actually see better performance in these channels that have consent prompts and the channels that are scan directly impacted. And the reason is very simple: is there's less people buying on performance on those channels, because a lot of them have resulted to more like CPI style buying. They have just not crossed this chasm. So you just have to look at like, how is my competition also buying on this channel, and do I have edge I can get here? And the implications of ATT and scan are that there's now edge to be gained by doing data modeling where there wasn't in the past when everyone had perfect data.
Right. And to your point, I do see more of at least the studios with big hit games having a sort of data science team internally, more than I have before. But it does seem that they kind of have a split role. One part is for UA, and then there's also one part for like AI applications and trying to figure out how to integrate AI into their games. But yeah, that certainly I think you're right about that framework that you present and the importance of data analysis and science.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, we've had the pleasure of working with some of the biggest game companies in the world, and some of them have like pretty massive internal analytics and data science branches. There's been more than one time where like when we get to know how they're currently reporting on things, they essentially just have like no revenue reported for these SAN channels because they don't have an internal data model or they haven't established a best practice for it. So even with some of the large teams, there's still big gaps here. I do want to speak to like the idea of like, is this going to be less accurate than fingerprinting? absolutely. But we just have to look at what I recommend is like just having as long as you have an apples to apples methodology that you're applying to all of the channels to look at their success side by side, that's still ultimately going to let you assess directionally which channels are higher and lower performing. And you can take that on down to campaign level and creative level to resource your budget. It's something that like sometimes even when we're getting to know teams, talking to teams, there's a lot of pushback to it because it's a big transition to make from like knowing exactly what happened, which is the world that you and I kind of came up in, to like, wait, so now we have to kind of, quote unquote, guess or like just kind of model out what's happening. And you always have the alternative is that you're just looking at your blended ROAS and doing like, MMM stuff. And it's like, that's kind of like a fallback, but it doesn't let you make the operational decision of like, is this campaign performing better than this campaign? Is this creative performing better than this creative? Like the actual usability of those approaches to making UA decisions, there's like a huge gap. So we're big proponents that you need some way to model at a granular level of just like what's working and not working.
And so in a world of imprecise data, are there general characteristics of whether it's ARPU or payback that are favored? So for example, I've worked on games before where the initial retention was absolute trash, right? So like call it 25% D1, maybe 3% D30, but the D365 was like slightly less than 3% too. So, and it just continued to monetize over a long period of time. And we'd see revenue stacking over a very, very, very long period of time. But I would assume in a world where there's a lot of imprecise data that I'm not sure if you'd be able to, you're going to have to wait a really long time for those kinds of games. They're not that common, but then being able to tell whether the game is actually profitable over that super long period of time. I don't know if you can do that anymore in today's environment.
No, and I realize we kind of passed over that, but I do think that there's sectors of gaming that are going to be higher impact and in line with your intuition, Joseph. So it's like, okay, so let's take a sample number.
Okay.
Which is that on Meta, an opt-in rate that we might see typically is maybe like 1 out of 6 to 1 out of 7 users. Okay, cool. So say that that means whatever data point you're using for optimization, if it's revenue, if it's an event, that you essentially are losing, like 5/6 of that at least, right? If you then think about different game models, the games that we've probably seen navigate this the smoothest are those that have frequent data to fuel the algorithms, like frequent small purchases, right? Or a lot of ad revenue. So like, even though you're only getting a subset of the data, you're still getting enough to where you can get insights down to a more granular level. And you can also, have more data points to feed the algorithms. To your analogy earlier of Forex or these games where maybe only a small number of users, the machine zone model where like it's a brutal funnel, but those that make it through the funnel spend a lot. Yeah, this methodology is going to have, or any methodology, like you're only going to have the consent of, now you have like a fraction of a fraction. So I do think that those games are still going to be challenged on the consent managed channels. So at the least, like this kind of methodology will let you view what's working and what's not working. But there's just going to be less data points that make it through these algorithms because of this impact, especially as it starts applying to more and more channels. So I think like I'm not a game designer by trade, but if I was a game designer, what I would be thinking about is implementing some sort of data point for optimization that's going to happen frequently no matter what. And one thing that we work on with like our games that are maybe deeper funnel monetization is like, okay, cool. Well, let's set revenue aside for a second. Do we want to optimize campaigns to like a tutorial complete or some sort of like CPA methodology where we're going to get a more frequent firing and data signal to kind of bridge that divide?
To be more actionable for some of the folks who might be listening or watching that are working on games today and trying to do user acquisition for games. Can you talk about, since you have been working with a lot of different clients and you have, you've got visibility on a lot of different types of games and user acquisition strategies. So in terms of channels and tactics that have done reasonably well, have been actionably scalable in, sort of like earlier this year or this second
Mhm.
half of 2024, and what you think will continue to work in 2025. Can you talk about what you've been seeing?
Yeah, I think the good news here is there's really only a handful of types of channels that people need to master. Earlier in, not to keep going to back in the day stuff, but it used to just be like, I'm sure similar for you and your friends, like we'd go to a trade show, go to MAU or whatever, and come back with like a list of new ad networks that we want to try, right?
Mhm.
It's not really that anymore. It's sort of like you identify who has first party inventory, and I'll clarify like my definitions of that. You master those channels, and that's kind of it. And so to break that down specifically, we have the large SANs, which we'll just basically identify as Google, Meta, TikTok, and then to a lesser degree, as far as scale, I'd put Snapchat and Apple Search in this bucket as well. Those are all great first party channels to master. And TikTok, Meta, and Snapchat are all going to have very similar methodologies, UIs, tactics, etc. So they're all kind of in one bucket. The next bucket is the in-app rewarded video networks, essentially ironSource/Unity, Applovin. Metagroll has been a good one lately. Their rewarded inventory specifically, Vungle, smaller, but kind of that pocket.
Mhm.
What we've generally cut out of the diet, and this is no shade to my friends who work at DSPs, but we see in this new world, like DSPs adding very little value to the ecosystem. And it kind of comes back to what we were talking about up top, which is that the algorithms are a DSP's value is really they're plugging their algorithm in as a middleman, and you're paying them a margin.
Yep.
They do not have traffic of their own. As the algorithms of first party sources get more advanced, the incremental value in giving away like 20%, I've seen 40% margin at some of these DSPs. It's not worth the cost of admission. If you have like a halfway competent buying team and you're leveraging the algorithms and best practices of these networks, like we have DSPs in our stacks less and less. And I'm probably going to get blown up by a few of my friends that work at DSPs for this, but that's just kind of what the data is showing us. It's like I can't come up with another business case to invest heavily with the DSP, especially like what we see in our testing.
And
So that's
Warren,
kind
maybe
of
I could ask you, maybe I could push on that a little bit in terms of
yeah,
like, so,
please.
so the last couple of conferences I attended and just speaking to a number of folks, some of the things I've been hearing is that on that side, in terms of talking about the Applovins and Unities, and those two companies in
Mm,
particular, kind of the narrative that I've been hearing is that Applovin is just killing it. They're taking a lot of share, and that Unity is declining relative to Applovin. And so, wondering whether you would agree with that narrative and whether you can comment on maybe what the potential dynamics that are occurring there are. Is that happening? And if so, why would that be happening?
I also hear anecdotal evidence of that. We do a lot of business with both companies, so they're both like good partners of ours. And so I won't state any shade to either here, but I'll just kind of tell you what we're seeing.
Sure.
So in our portfolio, definitely not the case. We might have a slight bias towards, if anything, towards Unity Iron Source as far as like where we're spending a little bit more profitably. But this is actually no shade to Applovin.
Okay.
And what you're hearing might actually be correct. And it's for a very specific reason, which is like Applovin has always just had the most ruthless and effective sales team, I think, from a ad integrations standpoint. And
Yeah.
so why does that?
And most
Yeah,
charismatic too. Those guys are
like legendary, right? Love them or hate them, like they're really good at what they
Yeah,
do. So
absolutely.
I think this has like an effect directly to UA as well. And so I'll clarify why. So especially in recent years, if you are buying on either the Iron Source side or the Applovin side, if you also if your app is also doing admon with them, you're going to get a level of granularity of data. You're basically going to get the admon data in a direct stream in a way that you wouldn't if you were using the other mediator. So sorry, I'll state it a different way. If a game is using max ads,
Mhm.
Applovin, for their mediation, they are almost certainly going to see better performance buying Applovin traffic than buying Iron Source traffic. Conversely, if a game is using Iron Source mediation, they're going to see better Iron Source performance than Applovin.
Ah,
That's kind of what we've seen across the
okay.
board. Pretty neutral. So why might Applovin? I don't know if they're doing better or not, honestly, but I could see a world just because they are always so on point and aggressive with their scales, their sales process and getting integrations, if they are claiming more market share from an integration standpoint, that's going to have a follow-on effect of probably getting more UA market share. I haven't seen enough data to know if that's actually the case, but there's going to be a direct correlation between who's getting the mediation integrations and eventually over time that leading to more UA market share as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. And yeah, and just to be clear, like what I've been hearing is very anecdotal. So, talking about maybe like 5 data points. So very, not
Yeah, and
anything
ours,
comprehensive or conclusive at all. So
yeah, ours is anecdotal as well too, because it's like even though like for reference, like we manage maybe currently like mid 7 digits monthly ad spend budget, but that's still like call it max 20 concurrent games that are current size that we're doing. So it's still a tiny slice of the industry even if it's some of the bigger games. So we're going to have an innate bias just towards the mediation mix in our portfolio.
right. So maybe the other thing I could ask you about, and I kind of really like your framework in terms of like you were saying like data, the operations, and then the creatives, right? And so when you think about a modern day performance marketing UA team today, how would you then think about how you would construct that kind of a team early on and then at scale? Would you then also go to like 200 people in creatives and things like that? Like, how would you recommend for a mobile game studio out there thinking about, launching a game and starting a mobile marketing team? How would you think about constructing that team? What roles, how many people, what would that look like to you? And what are the specific variables that would influence what that team looks like?
Yeah, the way we think about it is less so much as people specifically, but you need to address those core functions.
Okay.
And there's sort of this spectrum of like humans to tooling that like the percentage mix can vary by these functions. So to say a little more plainly, like when we started Upptic and like in my past working internally on growth teams at publishers, it was sort of like, okay, cool. Every game we're working on has a creative lead, a UA lead, and an analyst responsible for the data function. As we've built up Upptic here, like, because the easiest thing to kind of automate and reduce the human capital, just to be like really, it might sound blunt or crass, is the data function, because the problems that you need to solve are very redundant between project and between company. It's like you need to build these 30 dashboards. You need to build a scan model. You need to forecast ROAS. You need predictive LTV. Like the problems are the same. And what I saw in my career is like, okay, show up on a new team, build the same 20 dashboards, build the same data model. It's like, so this is stuff at Upptic where we're like, okay, well, let's just productize this for at least for ourselves first and foremost. So we don't need like an analyst to rebuild the same 20 dashboards every time we spin up a new game. So that's all to say, like of those 3 elements, like the data modeling side, I think is the easiest one that you can maybe use tooling instead of just like human capital and brute force. The other 2 though are interesting to touch on. Like UA also, like the amount of human capital is going way down that you need to invest because the algorithms are getting more advanced. The third one that we haven't dug into as much is the creative side. This is probably the most interesting one to watch like here in 2024, because not to overuse it, but like AI is making an impact here. It's not yet at the point where we're like, okay, we don't need humans to make creative anymore. And I don't think it's going to be that anytime soon. Mm-hmm. Actually, within our departments, you might think that like our engineering team is the most AI driven. It's actually our creative team that's the most active users and forward thinking with AI here. And they're sort of leveraging it to like improve pieces of their funnel. Like they might use it for like producing like quick and dirty concepts of something, or producing an asset, or making an element to be used in a creative that might have taken more manual production before. So it's being streamlined, but it's still the area of those 3 pillars where you kind of need the most human capital to get a good outcome. But that framework is all to say, like all of these have these mixes of kind of what can be automated and what is human. And these things are always kind of variable over time, depending on how the rules change. So I don't know if that's like too broad of a framing. Does it make sense?
Yeah, or maybe just more specifically, and maybe selfishly, I could ask you, since we're going to soft launch a shooter game early next year. how should I be thinking about building a marketing team? Like, and it does seem like I am seeing more anecdotally that it does seem like for companies that are early until they achieve product market fit to scale, like working with companies like Upptic or with Mate or whoever's out there. There's a bunch of folks out there. Seems to be like the better approach than to build a huge internal team. It seems like the better approach is, hire one or two internal folks to work with a growth agency of some kind. And then at scale, maybe then you can bring it back internally after a certain level of scale where it makes more sense. But I don't know, how would you think about that? Or are there reasons why you should just have an internal team and build that out? And if so, what would be an example of how you would split that up in terms of like roles and the number of people?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'll try to answer this, as neutrally as possible. Like, you have to be really careful with agencies. So you have to really look at like what their incentive model is, like what are the scenarios where they make more money, and is it correlated to your success or antithetical?
Yeah.
If their main KPI is ad spend, there's going to be some like natural tension because your goal as a founder or an
model.
executive.
But I mean, it's been a little while for me, but it's generally been a percentage of ad spend in the past, right? Is that the current model, or has it changed?
I think it's still probably the default model. We position ourselves a little bit more to like a fractionalized staffing service. So it's sort of like you get a fraction of a 40-person team, and think of it more like model out comparative to headcount. So it's a little different business model here. And I don't want to turn this into like too much time on Upptic here, but what I would say, like, if you're trying to be really lean, Joseph, you've launched and been part of a lot of game launches. Like, most games, even with a good team, are not going to be hits. So I think there's a lot of risk in building out a full growth org before you have that data.
Yep.
So I would always advise any of my friends that are building games in like kind of think in two stages, with just like proof of concept and scaling. For proof of concept, you want to be as lean as possible. For someone like yourself that has a lot of experience, you might not even need a dedicated marketing director, user acquisition director. You clearly have enough working knowledge to understand if whoever your partner or resource was that was doing UA to you could understand that data as someone's talking it through. Some teams don't have that, so they need one executive level that at least understands and can communicate with whoever your marketing arm is, whether that's internal or external. That being said, you don't need to solve all the problems that we talked about today. You just need to get a few thousand users through the funnel and do a soft launch. You can do that on one channel. You can do it without having this advanced modeling, and you just need to see if the game has a pulse and work out the issues. And I really recommend teams do not ramp up their marketing orgs before they see if they have this proof of concept, because I'm sure it's happened to you. I mean, it's happening to me on half the soft launch games we have right now, where you go through soft launch, great team, and it goes to soft launch. It's crap, there's actually a lot we need to fix here, And so if your burn rate's up here because you built out the 20-person marketing team, that's can be a death sentence in some cases.
Right.
So that's the proof of concept phase. I'd say you want 0 to 1 internal marketing hires, and depending on if they're comfortable operating those campaigns, it could just be them, operating one channel, doing soft launch from that. If not, you can use an agency, a consultant, something like that. But just make sure it's someone you trust that's got an aligned incentive, and that's not going to be telling you to spend more. In soft launch, you want to spend the minimum viable dose to get the sample size you need, right? And then review that data together.
Right.
So that's kind of stage one. Yeah. And then
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. And then if you get a proof of concept that, okay, cool, the ARPU looks good, retention looks good, then you need to set up for scaling. That's a completely different ballgame. This is when you want at least the power of an army but that's when you have to do kind of the buy versus build approach of cool, we think we have a good proof of concept. Who are we as a business? Do we want our and I think for a publisher, there's maybe a little more incentive to build the internal team and resourcing, because the publishing is your business versus if you're a developer,
right,
the game is your business, and maybe that's where using a partner can be more effective. So that's high level. Just if you take one thing away from this, you want your proof of concept before you make the massive investment in your go-to-market resource.
Right. And one thing you mentioned earlier in this conversation is that kind of potentially a new alpha is integrating a product team with user acquisition. And I know people have been talking about that for a long time. I think that the probably the best example that we've seen today or more recently is with games like Whiteout Survival and Total War, where the marketing function is, intricately linked with the actual game design and the game product itself. But, as games and marketing data continue to fragment, how should game teams think about unifying their data, aligning different teams? How should we be thinking about teams, data, so that we can achieve profitable games growth and be a lot different from like the ZERP past where there was a lot of just like shenanigans.
Yeah, it's a really good topic. So it might sound like I was maybe talking trash on like the user acquisition or growth profession earlier when I was saying like a lot of the operational work is dumbed down. For the smart teams, what growth marketers are doing, what we try to do on our UA or growth marketing function is like move up the value chain. Like you now, because you don't need to like pull up a massive spreadsheet and optimize every sub publisher on Unity manually.
Yep.
That's the algorithm's handling that now. The AI is handling that now. Cool. Move up the value chain. Work more closely with the product team. Understand that when the overall metrics are falling short, okay, ROAS isn't hitting the mark. Rather than just diagnosing it from, okay, what are we, on the UA side, what are we doing? And that blame game of like, is it UA, is it product? Like just crossing that chasm
Right.
and working hand in hand with the product team of seeing like, okay, cool, we're seeing breakage. Let's like analyze that and see which parts of this breakage are within our control as your marketing resource, and how can we help you diagnose the product resource. And what we learn is like, we're definitely not game designers, we're not product people, but just launching 50 plus games, we start to see patterns. And so where we've started adding a little more value is happens all the time. We soft launch a game, metrics aren't there. Before we even start having like a blame game of like, okay, does this mean you're bringing us the wrong users, UA? We're like, okay, cool. Everyone on the Upptic team, let's log all of our feedback for a developer partner. Let's do screenshots, let's capture video, and let's basically like help them do funnel analysis, because they maybe don't have those reps in place. So at that point, we're kind of like triaging with our developer. And I think that does a few things. It shows like, hey, we're all working on the same funnel together. And also like, we're not trying to play a blame game here. We're just looking at both stuff in our realm and in your realm.
Right. And I'm not sure if people fully realize this issue that you talk about, like UA versus product team, the blame game. I'm not sure if people really fully understand how much this happens and how toxic it can be when, in fact, you're the same team, right? It should be, one team, one goal. And it should be, to your point, this could be a great opportunity for marketers to your point, move upscale, to align more strongly with the product teams and to actually, consider themselves as part of the same team, because I do think some of those conflicts lead to not only the blame game, but then wanting to prove your point about this or that and not helping each other out just because there's these internal conflicts that are just kind of nonsense or just kind of like silly.
Yeah, and one way that I find for anyone working on the growth UA side, one thing that's helped us a lot to navigate this is basically set expectations before it happens. So like, say that we're starting a tech launch in the Philippines for a game. We will try to let our partner know ahead of time, like, okay, we're starting a tech launch together. You're probably going to see when we start this tech launch that you see like low LTV from these users, and we might see really bad retention and more crashing than you expect. This is why we might see this in this phase. These are the aspects of this that are related to UA, such as like our choice of targeting types or choice of countries. These are aspects related to your product. Like, the market we're going to is going to have more lower quality devices. So you might see a higher crash rate. Also, there's usually in a soft launch, there's going to be some technical issues uncovered in this first phase.
Yep.
So we find that by like, essentially it's a lot easier to tell someone bad news before it happens than try to justify it after the fact. And that's been a very productive thing to implement. And then, I mentioned earlier, but I would really restate too, when you're trying to triage these problems, have your marketing team playing the game and identifying where in the funnel things in the game could be an issue. Like there's been a number of times that we found out like scan implementation was off, or that there wasn't a proper FTUI just by spending a little more time actually in the app. And there are things that sometimes the developer might take for granted because they're living in the world of the game and might forget some of these things that are like blockers to net new users from either a data telemetry standpoint or from just like a user flow standpoint.
Right. And maybe two more questions I have for you.
Mhm.
But the first one is like, back in the day, the heyday of user acquisition, which, iconically probably represented by Machine Zone and Game of War, where they spent hundreds of dollars a year on mobile game marketing. There were these huge campaigns and things like that. How would you characterize whether those approaches would still work or how things have changed since then?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I know I said before we started recording that I wouldn't talk about any Web3 stuff on this one, but I will. I think there's something that rhymes with this. So we're recording this on October 15th, and last week we had a really big breakthrough in the Web3 space of a game called Off the Grid. And they basically went to, on the game side, like they just avoided a lot of the pitfalls of crypto games of putting the Web3 stuff at the forefront. They just made it a really high quality shooter game. But the reason I'm bringing this up relative to Machine Zone in the heyday is they went to the very top of the food chain for the streamers and content creators they worked with. So they worked with like people like Ninja on the launch.
Okay.
And that's something that usually games coming from the Web3 space, they would, either they wouldn't be accepted by those content creators, they'd be working with more the mid-tier or like the crypto native creators. They really broke through because they went to the top of the food chain. And even though there's a lot that I disagree with Gabe and some of the approaches that Machine Zone took, I think one thing that is a takeaway and can rhyme with current conditions is like, it's dangerous to get caught in the middle of the pack. And this is like speaking very broadly. So it's like, if you're working with content creators, it's almost like you need to be at the top of the food chain, or you need to really be arbitraging and kind of playing Moneyball. And I think there's a case to be made with UA as well. Like we can say something like, I don't know the ins and outs of Monopoly Go and like how that performance actually is. There's a lot of disparate opinions on this. But my sense is that they did that top of the food chain approach of like, we're just going to dominate the ad networks. And with the right product and dependent on your business goals, like that can still be a winning strategy. My God, is it a risky strategy? So definitely not recommending this.
Yeah.
But I think that's sort of like, I think if I think of the positive side of what Machine Zone learned, it's sort of like there's a positioning at top of the food chain that can unlock certain opportunities.
And maybe just to push on that a little bit more as well, because I recently recorded a podcast where we talked about Tencent. And one of the things that I think Tencent, I don't know if they popularized it because it's largely Tencent doing these, but like the launch velocity type of approach of having a lot of scale behind your UA, and the thinking being that after a certain amount of scale, there are nonlinear benefits and advantages to having like a huge launch. And so Tencent, for example, famously has specific minimum number of installs that are in the tens of millions. And they believe, and this is, I'm sure backed by many launches and data that they have, that once you reach a certain amount of scale, that you then, your CPIs are lower. There's word of mouth effects. There's all these other effects that are occurring. And as we see more people that are starting to play games as a group, and now we've seen like the emergence since COVID of group-based behavior becoming much more prevalent and things like that. So how do you think about minimum scale and that kind of effect where, I am seeing for some companies and some game executives I talk to, like a minimum budget that might be, $5 million, in some cases, maybe like $3 million, but they're trying to achieve a certain level of scale to get those nonlinear effects but to your point, that could be a very risky strategy if you're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a couple of very practical benefits of scale. So if we were to like dot plot out like all of the games we worked on and their level of users coming from paid marketing and level of organic users, you would see a very clear correlation. So like the K factor or correlated uplift from paid marketing absolutely exists. And there's like breakthrough points. Like if we see that halo effect as a percentage or K factor tends to increase as a proportion at larger scales. And I can't say without a shadow of doubt of why, but if you just think about it, so I just mentioned that game Off the Grid.
Yeah.
What we saw is that by working and getting a critical mass of content creators they started getting a ton of earned coverage as well. A lot of non-paid content creators started
Right.
covering them. More gaming press started covering them. That's not going to happen if you work with two small creators. There's a 0% chance of
Yeah.
that. And I think it's the same thing with paid marketing to some degree. Like there's breakthrough points where, in the old days, it was a very clear of like, oh, cool, we're higher on the charts, and like a higher chart position gets you more downloads. That's not really a thing anymore because the charts are buried.
Yeah.
But there's still sort of like cultural consciousness of just sort of like, is your game being played by a lot of people? Are they talking about it? Is it part of conversations on organic media? One of our biggest games now has never paid a content creator in their life, but it's just such a big game that they got to get a bunch of organic coverage, and we'll see huge spikes when organic content creators might pick it up in a certain week.
Right.
So that's absolutely one benefit. Another benefit is a lot more crass. And this is probably something that I'm guessing Machine Zone leveraged a lot too, going back to them, which is you just have a giant hammer for negotiations. So
Right.
definitely I've been part of projects where we're just able to straight up negotiate with ad networks that they need to reduce their margin, reduce their take on the campaigns in order to meet our business goals.
Yeah.
And like many other businesses, if your scale is large enough, you can reduce the margin of ad spend through negotiation, kind of brute force.
Yeah, I've heard MC
because
was
there's still enough upside.
fantastic at those kinds of negotiations.
I am sure they were. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there's a lot of advantages that you get at scale.
Yeah.
And a really basic one is just like account support. Like anyone who's tried
Right.
to launch a campaign on Facebook for a small game or, God forbid, a game with any kind of social casino real money knows that like you'll just get your account frozen. And like you can't talk to a human, and there's like no route to actually getting it resolved if you're not above a certain scale for a lot of developers.
Right. And the other thing that happens is sometimes your ad reps will give you certain information that maybe sometimes you shouldn't have if you have a certain scale of business with them. So
that's definitely a thing as well.
All right. So final question I have, Warren, is so what do you think is coming next? So if you are a UA marketing team or you're a game executive thinking about 2025, what should we be keeping our eye out for? Maybe it's fingerprinting, maybe it's something else. And what are specific things we should be watching out for, maybe potential risks we should be looking out for in 2025?
Yeah, this is maybe a hot take, and I didn't think about this ahead of time, but the place my head goes immediately is I think in the current economic conditions, mixed with the growth trajectory of AI, I think we're going to see a lot of game publishers trying to like Elon their organizations. Like, when Elon took over Twitter and just tried to, I think they both have permission with the current, what their peers are doing, and the macro conditions and kind of the wish and promise of AI that I think we're going to see, the last webinar we did, like we were kind of talking about this concept of lean growth, like what's sort of like the minimum dose and like what's the leanest you can make your operation and still get a meaningful outcome.
Right.
And that's something that we're thinking about a lot because that's where we're predicting the macro is going to go in the game industry is just sort of like brutal efficiency of like, even whether it's going to work or not, I'm predicting that in this next few years, we're going to see just sort of like teams cut down to the bone, teams trying to leverage AI in ways that both will and won't work, and just sort of experimentation with how lean can we make the human function of the marketing team. I don't know that it's correct or what the optimal mix is, but I'm expecting a lot of that type of experiment. And part of this will kind of go back to what you said up top is like a lot of teams are just not seeing the results they want with approaching things the old way. So I do think it's going to be a forcing function of just not seeing the results they want, that people are going to get pretty brutal with their experimentation.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. One of the things, again, from the last conference I was at that I've been hearing is like spend by mobile game studios is like an all-time low. Like nobody wants to spend any money right now. And so to your point, in speaking to other game execs and others, so yes, more layoffs are coming, unfortunately, still, probably throughout the end of the year and maybe into early next year. And I am starting to hear a lot of conversations about, how do we get more productivity?
Yeah, there's going to be some of that needed, especially for anyone that's, building from a smaller stage. Like it's going to be a period of brutal competition, and we're going to see a ton more thrash in the industry. But like these periods are painful, but they also kind of get me excited because this is like where teams can get their edge. Like in the ZERP environment, it's just sort of like who can throw the most money at the problem. A lot of times when people aren't really metrics driven, but yeah, I kind of embrace the chaos, and we just look for like, cool, is there something we can build? Is there a new strategy can we adopt to kind of like get our edge in this chaos?
Yeah, it's like like the famous saying behind the Chinese characters behind risk, right? Danger and opportunity. So I think
Yes.
that I believe for me is what really characterizes 2025. And cool. All right. Anything else we should be looking out for in 2025 that you think would be relevant, or is that generally what you're seeing or what you believe will be happening?
Yeah, another pet project of ours, I shouldn't say pet project, a big area that we're trying to build out into, and maybe we can regroup and talk about this sometime next year, is like, uh, it's clear that like, especially if you look more at the PC console sector, like creators are the main channel
Mhm.
for growth.
Yep.
It's such an immature channel though, as far as like taking a performance mindset to it. So that's where a lot of our R&D is right now, is like building out tools for like taking a performance mindset to creator marketing, and in-housing and building tech around more of that. So I think as we grow our business here at Upptic, like our vision is try to just be growth tools for games across where they're going from, and that's kind of what we see as like the ripest untapped pasture right now.
Mhm.
Is like there's a ton of money being dumped into creator marketing for PC and console, and a very little sense of like what's working and what's not. So that's going to be an area that me and the team are focusing on a lot in 2025, and I think probably going to be an area that, to your point, if more traditional performance marketing is not viable for certain teams, that they're going to try to unlock. Probably some will work, and a lot of money will be set on fire as well too.
Right. Okay, well, Warren, as always, it's awesome having you on. I think that again, the advantage, and I hope our listeners understand that like getting real talk on UA and marketing is very rare. So I absolutely appreciate your insights and sharing your knowledge about the industry. So thank you for that. And I think I would love to do a follow up interview discussion with you next year whenever it makes sense. And for our audience, I hope you learned something today, and we will catch you next time. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Warren.
Thanks, y'all.